Salford City Radio, 94.5 FM, the Friday Sports Show. Your host, Petruzzi, bringing you this area and around the world. We're very fortunate in this show to have interviewed some of the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches, people in the field of sports science, psych as well, and many other areas. And today's guest, we have a really fascinating guest. She's the player captain for Worcester City women's football team. She's also put really fascinating work in the field of sports science. She's the academy manager for science for sport, and she's going to give an insight into sports science in women's football. And no doubt many of our listeners will be interested, and I certainly am, fascinated, and I, be interesting to see her take on the sports science side of things in the women's game, and maybe even in general too. So, Jessica Fassnidge, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to speak to you, Jess. And Jess, if we sort of start from the beginning for you, sports science, and how do you sort of get into sports science? What sort of motivates you to go into the field of sports science?
Yeah, good question. So I think for me and my personal journey, it's not necessarily something when I was younger I thought I'd go into directly. It wasn't probably until I spent some time in America. So I was really fortunate to get a football scholarship. Spent 4 years playing football, obviously soccer to anyone that's from the US, at collegiate level. And it wasn't really until then it kind of opened up my eyes to, what you get over there as a student athlete. It was kind of blew my mind really compared to what I was used to from the UK. And I know a lot of people in the US who are probably based there and they're used to the infrastructure and kind of how that works and the setup there. But for someone from the UK who's, only ever really been accustomed to grassroots level and potentially not necessarily having the right kit, or there's lack of it, or you're struggling for players to go into more of a professionalised setup. So yeah, it probably wasn't until then that I dived into the sports science where we had access to S&C coaches, physiotherapists, sports scientists. And you're not just necessarily focusing on improving your game on the pitch. You're looking at what can you do off the pitch. So behavioural aspects, nutritional, biomechanical, what can you do in the gym with strength-wise, and obviously they kind of put all these elements together to kind of make you the best athlete you can be. And like I said, it probably wasn't until I went to the States and actually experienced it firsthand that I realised, okay, this is pretty cool. You can do this as a career and a role, and that kind of opened up my eyes to it and made me really, I guess, passionate about that area, that you can kind of do all these things and plug them all together to become a better athlete and essentially improve your performance.
Absolutely, and your time in America, Jess, and you obviously come back to the UK, and how much of an influence has that had on you in terms of how you sort of work professionally around sports science?
Yeah, do you know what? It's probably been really pivotal for my growth. Like I said, I probably wouldn't have got into it if I hadn't have gone to the States initially. But the learning and education you have over there, it was top notch. So I always rate and rave about it as much as possible. And I try and recommend as many people, if they get the opportunity to be a student athlete over there, I'm like, take it with both hands, because you'll learn so much about yourself. You're kind of putting yourself in a new culture. But from the sports science practical side, I think a lot of it, my initial learning came from over there. So I kind of started as a bit of a blank canvas, and I was super lucky to have, access at my fingertips to all these amazing people, from the data analysis side to the S&C coaches. Whereas back here, I'm not sure I would have had that initially, unless I'd have kind of transitioned into a club or played high level, or, kind of went down a different opportunity. But yeah, I think it definitely helped me just learn everything I could about the field. Obviously put it into practice, because I was a student athlete at the time, so I wasn't learning things from a coach perspective. I was learning about my body, how can I be a better athlete for the college I'm at. And then equally, once your time finishes, you kind of think, right, okay, what am I going to do? And I wasn't fortunate enough to be that level to be able to go on professionally, and that's when I thought, well, actually I've really enjoyed understanding how it works and improving my performance and my body in that way. How can I then do that for other people? And I think that's really how I got into it, was more so going through it myself, and then having opportunities afterwards to stay out in the States and coach at that level as well, and start working with athletes again from a then a coach perspective, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And in terms of, say, like sort of the work you do, and say that, I mean, say for example, if a club is part-time, if a club's sort of full-time, then they can sort of train every day, and they get the recovery. It's sort of, I guess, the sort of periodise the training is sort of one thing. But the players are kind of part-time and they're sort of working throughout the day. Some might have physical jobs, some might have jobs in, PE, some might have variety of different jobs. So, I mean, how do you adapt what you do with the players, Jess? Obviously, sort of like, and also you've got the physiological side of things too as well. So, I mean, how do you sort of do you find it sort of a challenge really to sort of like the training in terms of, say, for example, if the footballers are part-time in sort of how you go about the training physically, or do they do training outside the club? Or
absolutely, it's a massive challenge, and I think if you put it on a spectrum and you've got the professional element at one end of it, so you've obviously got your professional teams in the WSL and the Championship, and potentially it's even filtering down at the moment into kind of tier 3. Obviously, they're fully funded, so, the players there are being paid to play. That's their role. They've got access to what they need to be the best athletes. But then obviously on the complete other end of the spectrum, you've kind of got the grassroots level where a lot of teams were kind of built around the basis of just place for females to go, to play football, have fun, not necessarily have a drive or not necessarily be there to win, but kind of just be there more as a social and just enjoy playing. And most of the time, regardless which end you're at, you still want to win, whether you're a professional athlete or you're playing at grassroots level. There's still going to be that competitive element to win. But obviously priorities are very different then in terms of what you're doing physiologically with your body and how you look after yourself to then best perform. And I think the real challenge is actually the ones that are in between those. So clubs like Worcester City, where I'm at myself at the moment, we're in a position where we've got fantastic backing, we've got a great owner who's driving us forward, and we're the ones that want to strive to be at that professional level, but we're just a little bit shy of it. So we're not in a position or a level where players can be paid or staff can be paid. So everyone at our club is volunteered. Even the owner herself, the amount of work she does on it to drive our ship forward, that we say. So I think that's the real challenge then, is what do you then do when you've got all these people? And I say people because it's not just the players. I know we always automatically think that the players aren't being paid, but equally, you've got to have good coaches, you've got to have good people in and around to kind of move a club forward. It's not just what necessarily happens on the pitch. A lot of that is as a result of the people you have around helping, little pieces of the puzzle, I kind of like to say, that you plug together. But the challenge is massive, and I think what you have to do is it takes time. So I've been involved at Worcester City for as long as I can remember, really, but since Nicola only took over around 3 years ago, the club from where it was to what it is now is completely night and day. And you say 3 years, it feels like a long period of time, but in terms of football, it's not as much, and a lot of transitions happen for us. But I think one thing that I can recommend is you just need time, and you need to get the right people in, because like you mentioned, being part-time, most of the people involved in our setup are going to be mums, dads. They're going to be working full-time, working part-time, maybe having to do childcare, maybe playing sport themselves. They're balancing all these plates, and for them it's probably not, it's not going to be the main income because they're not making money from it. So they're then coming to football and training and trying to put on the best sessions and trying to give 100% in sessions, trying to do the extras outside of it to be best prepared. But it's a massive challenge because life gets in the way if you're really busy at work. And some players we have work in public sector, so we've got people in the police and fire and things like that. Obviously then they're balancing shift work alongside playing football, so they're not going to have a typical Saturday where they can chill and relax and eat good food before the game on Sunday. They're going to be potentially come off a night shift to then have limited sleep and go and play. So the challenges are definitely there, but the most important thing is kind of getting the right people in, and it definitely takes time. And once you get the right people in, that culture starts to get built. And once you've got that culture, then you've got people that are bought into it for the right reasons. They want to be there because they know it's not about getting to the next level to get money in their back pocket. It's actually because they want to be part of something bigger. No,
absolutely, and it's really interesting. Like in terms of the, I mean, I no doubt some of our listeners, I've sort of read a really interesting article you wrote, and on the article you talk about considerations like working with women in football physiologically, and also there was some normative data. In terms of normative data, the fitness sort of testing, Jess, I mean, I know it's obviously sort of like, difficult to say, but just out of interest, where would you say, I know obviously that it's not easy, but in terms of like, where would you say maybe a player that is playing professional is compared to maybe a part-time player in the third or fourth tier? What's the sort of gap do you think in terms of maybe, the VO2 test, the yo-yo test, the speed test? Is there sort of how much? What's the difference in levels in that sort of data?
Yeah, so it's really hard because, like you mentioned with the data, it's actually quite hard to find for female footballers in particular. And I think clubs that do it at the WSL level are probably going to be restricted or not necessarily share that with the wider population.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know that research is starting to go out more, and ACLs is a separate thing, but we know it's going to kind of go into the women's game. But it's really hard to kind of bridge that gap, and that's something I'm actually quite passionate about. Is if you're a tier 3 player, how are you then? What are you doing to kind of be a tier 1, a WSL player? And on the flip side, if you're a tier 5 player, what's the gap between you and tier 3? And just to give you a bit of context, so Worcester City women are currently at tier 5 at the moment. So obviously, if they get promoted, they go into the tier 4, which is the FA National League. But then being at tier 5 at the moment, we actually got the chance to play an FA Cup game where we played MK Dons. Now, MK Dons were considered tier 3. We ended up losing the game 3-0. It was a really good game for women's football in general. But I think comparing just from observation and being in it and watching it and seeing it, the main differences really were between the tier 5 and 3 were definitely the fitness aspects. You could see that the tier 3 players were stronger, quicker, fitter. They could recover. They didn't really drop off much. So obviously, at lower levels, you're probably going to see a drop off in certain times of the game. So towards the end of the first half and definitely towards the end of the second half. MK Dons certainly weren't like that. They did not drop off at all. But their kind of physiological metrics, I would imagine, would probably be on average a lot superior than kind of where ours were at the time. And I would only imagine it would be similar then looking at WSL to tier 3. But then you probably have got that technical element as well. You can have those players at professional level that are, working on their technique every single day. And I think the one thing that is huge is tactical analysis. I think that's going to be a massive thing between a WSL player versus someone in tier 3, 4, 5, whatever it may be, because that's a huge gap, I think, in the women's game is the tactical side.
No, absolutely. And what I find really interesting is sort of what you've mentioned there. I mean, it's like, I suppose the sort of challenge of working with a player that's part-time to try and, boost those fitness levels up, that sort of work rate in the game as well, with them only sort of, I mean, generally speaking, is it sort of fair to say they maybe train twice a week at the club itself, and then whether they go away and train, I suppose it's a difficult one to kind of legislate, because like if they've got other jobs that are quite physical and demanding, it's the sort of balance between overtraining. But in terms of, I suppose it's probably an impossible question to answer, but you kind of wonder, are the players there because they've got that sort of, genetic capability to train and get to that level, or are they there because training, or, you sort of start to wonder, can a player in a division sort of outside the third or fourth division, how far can they improve? But I suppose the specific question is, in terms of trying to sort of improve the players physically, how would you sort of go about doing that, Jess, in terms of, like, if you've only got those sort of most clubs might train 2 nights a week, would you then sort of expect them to sort of go away, or suggest that they go away and do some training as well, or would that be sort of determined by what they do outside the club's work as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it depends. It's all within context, right? So if you've got a club, again, I relate to Worcester City Women because I'm in it and I know how we do things. But if you've got a club that has aspirations to kind of be as high as they possibly can in the future, you naturally want players that are going to do everything they can to physically prepare and look after themselves and maintain their fitness. So you're not just expecting them to turn up on, let's say, Tuesday, Thursday, do their training session with the club, and then turn up on a Sunday and that's it. Obviously, there's all the other things you need them to buy into. And again, it really depends on the context of the club and ambitions and where they want to go. And naturally, you're going to have a different pool of people, right? When you're working in kind of any MDT, or, it doesn't even have to be within football. It could be in an office job or a business. When you're working in a team, naturally, you're going to have different people that bring different characteristics and personalities. And, again, naturally, it's football. Everyone is more than likely going to be there because they love it at the grassroots level and they've enjoyed playing football. But equally, you're going to have some of those, that want to train all the time. And for someone like me, training is a really important part of my routine. And I know that when I'm working, if I've got a long day, I adapt my days to be able to get my training in. But naturally, you'll have some people who either, for them, they're either not educated on it, so they need to kind of learn it. They could be at a younger age. So, you get your S&C coaches, sports scientists, therapists come in to educate that individual on kind of why doing these things will help them and how it will improve their game and potentially give them more minutes at the end of the day. I mean, I always say this, football players are selfish. Everyone wants to play. You always see kind of where your traits fit at the end of the day. It's only when you're a coach and you kind of step out of that, you realise how hard it is to then, deal with all these personalities. But then obviously you do have some naturally who they just don't enjoy the training element, and that's where you've got to kind of have that buy-in from those individuals of, if you don't like the training, that's okay. We're not asking every person to be at the club to love going and doing sprints or doing fitness tests. But if you're going to buy into what we're doing as a club and you want to get minutes and you want to perform on this team, it's one of those non-negotiables that unfortunately you're going to have to do. It's part of the game. So yeah, don't get me wrong, it's definitely a challenge, but I think you need to implement things within the MDT, whether it's the S&C coach providing some education. We're really fortunate where we have loads of different people that are kind of involved in the team that pull everyone together. So if people, let's say, do have busy weeks at work and they struggle with the fitness, or maybe they don't have access to a gym, or maybe they have just come back from injury, they've got all these tools and resources available to them. And I'm not saying you have to use fancy apps and stuff. Obviously, that's like the utopia. If you can use an app, amazing, as an S&C coach. But when you're kind of on the ground and you strip it back, more often than not, even with the data analysis, if you don't have access to that at the lower levels, there's so much you can still do to best serve that athlete. And sometimes it's simple as they can't get to the gym on these days, what can they do at home? Or do they go and enjoy doing sprint training but not continuous training? Or do they like going on the rower at the gym but they really can't stand running? And it's how can you tweak things to best help that individual, regardless if they're kind of grassroots level or kind of creeping up and wanting to be higher.
No, absolutely. And in terms of like yourself, I mean, in terms of say like in terms of periodizing the training at the sort of at the level you obviously had, certain things are going to be sort of confidential, and I'm not suggesting you sort of but will you do like will you do fitness testing and then like retest and test again throughout the year, just to sort of have an idea where the players are and sort of maybe tailor training for them, or does that sort of happen?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point, because I think a lot of clubs will do it very differently and they'll kind of do what works for them. I think something, anytime I've been involved in a club or at collegiate level where I could be a player or I could be on the coach, we've always done some form of testing. And I think the only thing I would say around the testing part is it all sounds really good and well in theory, but if you're not going to use that data for anything practical, then essentially what is the point? Because you want to see the levels that young players are at, and that's why I always think doing stuff in pre-season is good. But again, if you're at a grassroots level, are you having players come in for pre-season having done nothing for 2 months? Or are they ticking over and doing a little bit? So when they come in, you could do a fitness test and you could push their bodies to new levels to get adaptation. Or actually, if they've done nothing, are they then going to probably get injuries in that first week? So I do think you have to do some kind of pre-season testing. Again, you'll have players on both ends of the spectrum, and it probably happens at the professional level. They'll be given programs to follow. You see it in the news and social media where, occasionally some of the players have kind of brought out, or have they done anything, in the off season, which is natural. You will get people on both ends of that spectrum, but I think you have to do something in pre-season, but you have to use that data in the right way. There's no point saying we're going to do these 10 tests to gold standard equipment and get all the data and it look really good to then not do anything, because then what you find is you kind of lose that buy-in with the players. They struggle anyway, and they understand they've got to do it because that's part and parcel of being involved in a club and striving and being better. Is where are you at the start versus the middle versus the end? But you want to create that buy-in, and the best thing you can do is collect that data, whatever test you choose, do the test correctly, as time effective and efficient as you can, get that data in as an MDT, look at that data, think about how you're going to then distribute it to players. Are you going to sit down individually? Are you going to do it as units? So you're going to compare like with Z scores, like defensive unit compared to each other, goalkeepers, etc. And then talk to players on like, okay, so this is what it means. This is where you are in compared to everyone else as an average. This is what it means for us forward, and this is where we would like you to get to. I think if you're just doing the test and not giving the players any information, it's a waste of time for everyone, even if you've got that data. But I always think doing pre is always good. Probably mid-season is always a good one. And then, again, I've been at clubs where they do it towards the end of the season. I've been at some clubs where they don't do it towards the end. It's a long season, isn't it, football? So I think it's dependent on injury levels and things like that when you get to the tail end of the season. Absolutely.
No, it's really interesting. Like, I saw a research paper a while back. I don't recall off the top of my head that sort of springs something to mind, the authors, but they sort of mentioned there was like a correlation between the yo-yo test levels and sort of players, female players, going on to play at the highest level. Now, whether that's sort of, it's hard to write anything into that sort of being a sort of correlation, whether that's sort of a genetic thing that they are and have that athletic ability is one thing. But sort of that brings me on to sort of like same again. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to reveal what tests you do, but I mean, you do mention in an article you wrote some really interesting tests. To be fair, I mean, the practicality of sort of doing all of them, I suppose. Which ones would you say in terms of like? I guess you're taking practicality into consideration and a few other things, time and how you can implement like from a reliable perspective. But are there any ones that you think would be? What do you find, in your opinion, Jess, the most useful ones for you to utilise, and then maybe this gives us a bit of a benchmark we can sort of work towards?
Yeah, so I think you have to do some kind of aerobic capacity test or estimated VO2 test. Now, obviously, I say estimated because more often than not, especially at the lower leagues and levels, you're not going to have access to the full gas analysis, which would be ideal. It would be great. But I'd say you'd have to do some kind of aerobic one. But in terms of like agility, strength, power, change direction, all those things, I think it would be dependent on together as an MDT. Let's say you've had one season and you've kind of come together and you reflect on that season. I think you've really got to look at, right, where are some areas we struggled? And I include injuries in this too, because there are obviously tests you can do from a balance perspective, more strength side in terms of the differences between the left versus the right leg, because obviously discrepancies can potentially lead to injury. I think you kind of have to sit together and reflect on a season of like, okay, so what went well and what needs to be improved? Were there a lot of injuries? Did we find that was because of, for example, were there a lot of hamstring injuries? If there was, maybe that's where you actually structure in a strength test at the start of the new season, so you can monitor strength levels in terms of the hamstring through, Nordics, whatever it may be that you decide. But there's loads you can choose from, and I think that's often the problem is there's so much out there. It's quite easy just to cherry pick ones. And in terms of football, you want them to have a good aerobic capacity, but equally, football isn't necessarily just about it's not full on sprinting, and it's obviously not all low intensity. It's got that balance. And I think, from previous studies, I know there's a study that was over nearly 20 years ago, and they probably need to do a bit of a more updated one, but they looked at exploring the standing, walking, low intensity, high intensity rates in women's football, and I think the high intensity equated to about 4.8% of the game was high intensity, and I think the low intensity was around 34%, and then you have the rest made up from walking and standing. Now, again, although that is 20 years ago, I think it's a little bit similar in the men's game as well, is taking gender out of it. You're going to have moments where the high intensity is probably not going to be as high because you've got to last a duration, haven't you? Your body's got to recover, your energy system kind of work together. And I think that's where you really need to then determine what is the best test. So, a lot of the times the yo-yo 1 and 2 are often used. I always think the yo-yo 2 is not a bad test. It's quite easy to set up. You can do multiple players at one go, which is obviously always important because you can just smash through them in 20 minutes. You can probably hit the whole team up. But then obviously you do have like the MAS test. You've got mile tests. There's loads that you do. I mean, the Bronco test has been a good one. I think a lot of people in the professional leagues use that. So personally, again, it would be, I think every season's different, every club is different, every team is different. You'd need to analyse like what are the most important things, because you might do your aerobic test but actually think, do you know what, we don't need to focus on 5 metre, 10 metre sprint. We actually need to make sure none of the players are getting hamstring injuries this year, so let's make sure we implement a test to see what's their starting, ideally where do we want them to be at against normative data, and then that's something we can keep monitoring as the season goes on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, you mentioned the yo-yo too, Jess. What was just interesting there is a sort of, there seems to be sort of data on the yo-yo. Is there any reason why you mentioned the 2 rather than the 1? I mean, this is just my own personal interest really in terms of doing the yo-yo 2 rather than the yo-yo 1. Is there anything specific why that was the case, or?
Do you know what? I think it's just more so the yo-yo 1 is often used for general population, so kind of anyone that's not necessarily, an athlete. Whereas the yo-yo 2 is kind of something I think I've just always used and always been part of during, being an athlete and going through the tests. I think it just starts a little bit later on, the yo-yo 2, if I remember.
Of course,
but that's normally the main difference. Is I think athlete-based, if you're involved in the sport, you'll normally go down the yo-yo 2 route.
Of course, yeah, no, definitely, yeah, and sort of the data being sort of wider, but like you mentioned there, so it's outside the sport as well, and I'd be like to sort of be placed to a certain degree where there's sort of data in other areas as well. And what I find interesting too, and I think is a really interesting sort of component of the article that you wrote about sort of considerations working in the women's game, sort of from a physiological perspective. If say, for example, someone has worked in the men's game in sports science or SNC, and I know sort of, with the time that we have, what are some things to sort of take in consideration? I found also you had like a link to an app in the article, which is quite interesting really. But just say, for example, Jess, what would you say if someone hasn't worked in the women's game before in sports science and they're sort of going in that direction? What are some sort of key things for them to take on board, working with women in women's football?
Yeah, it's a really good question actually, and I think even in the women's game there's still a lot of like in the job roles around the women's game there's still a lot of males that take those positions, and some of them have had previous experience either playing or being involved in football through the men's side before maybe transitioning to the women's side. And I think the game itself is still the same, right? It's still 11v11 players on the pitch. For the most part, you're kind of asking the same qualities as a right back for a male one versus a female one. You're still wanting the same qualities in players, and obviously it's dependent on the coach and the tactics they want and their philosophy. But I think really the main thing is always be led by the research, which again I know it's limited. But if you're an S&C coach that's been in the men's game, you're going to have access to more normative data. You're going to be able to probably get access to it more to best help your players. Whereas in the women's game, it's going to be a little bit more tricky to do that. And so if you're not at a high level, what I recommend is, and even if you are, like it doesn't really matter if you're at Tier 5 versus the WSL. If you're at Tier 5, are you going to want to use WSL data? Probably not, because you're going to realise 99% of your players are going to be miles away from it. So when you sit down with them and say, hey, you're way too slow compared to Ella Toon, who's in the WSL, you're not really going to get much excitement from that player or anything. So I think you have to be led by the data and the research, but if you haven't got access to that, use normative data yourself with the players you have, so you can create your own norm with your players. So if you I appreciate it's going to probably be a bit of recycling where you get players that come in and out, but create your normative data based on your squad. So if you've got first team development teams, reserve teams, get their data and information and use that as kind of your baseline. Obviously then look at the research. What does the research say in terms of players? Not necessarily players, it can be outside of football context, but players, or people, cyclists, runners, what's their typical VO2? Now again, I know it's going to be different, but you can still kind of get some information to give you a rough idea of how you create your normative data yourself, because obviously a VO2 max of a marathon runner is probably going to be significantly higher than a football player. So I'm not saying to go out to read the research around marathon runners and then use that as your baseline, but just do a little bit of reading, because reading different sports and seeing the VO2s and then comparing it to general population kind of informs your reading a bit more, and you kind of get a bit of a bubble of, right, this is kind of where the high end's at, this is the low end, what do other team sports say, and you can kind of then create your normative data based on what you've read and the players you have. And I think the only other thing really is, you do your needs analysis, that's still the same, so that will be informed by, the research, but it's just having considerations around the typical female body versus the male body. So obviously things like hormone levels, the menstrual cycle is obviously a big one. You're probably going to find that injuries might be very different in the men and women's game. Like typically, yes, there might be hamstring injuries and ankle rolls and things like that, but you look at the amount of ACLs that happen in the women's game, obviously it's a consideration you need to think about going into women's football. And I'm not saying you sit everyone down and talk to them about ACLs. A lot of them will see it in the press, whether you're a professional athlete or grassroots level. ACLs is everywhere. You talk about women's football and it feels like that's the first thing that comes up. So people will have that in the back of their mind. They don't need that seed planted. It's about how can you best support them. So to make them feel at ease, what strategies can you put in place? Now, you'll never prevent injury, like it's really hard. You can put strategies in place, but equally, if a player's going to get injured and they go into a contact challenge and they get injured, it's going to happen, unfortunately. It's part and parcel of the game, but it's what strategies can you do to best help players? And more often than not in the women's game, I think we focus so much on the menstrual cycle being a reason why ACLs happen. And actually I think it's just multifaceted with ACLs. I think the human body for a female is different, the physiology makeup, and I don't necessarily think it's grass versus turf or the shoes. it could be any of those.
Of course,
like you can't. I personally don't think you can pinpoint it on one of those things. But I think you've just got to be aware going into the women's game that could be there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, there's a lot of variables, and understanding each sort of variable, and obviously sort of like, navigating you sort of way through. And in terms of, say, the training itself, like throughout, say, the pre-season and like in season, and so you've got obviously in a part-time club, there's obviously so many things that it's implement. You've got obviously the football side of things too, the tactics, the football work as well. So you're sort of negotiating time as well. I sort of mentioned earlier about maybe some players doing some stuff away from there. I mean, the work away from the club. I mean, what's your take on things like, say, yoga, swimming, Pilates? I suppose if it's the benefit for that. For me, Jess, would be someone goes away, does some yoga, if they, Pilates, it's got like a multi-benefits, maybe good for the mind as well too, maybe going for a swim if they've got time to do it. What's your maybe take on that as well, sort of making some of those suggestions if that's something the players sort of would enjoy doing, they'll get benefit from it physically, but also possibly even mentally a bit of a benefit there too.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that's the most important thing is, sometimes it's a great tool for recovery. So if you're playing a match on a Sunday, regardless if you've played 90 minutes or 60, 70 minutes and it's quite intense, you're obviously going to have to recover the next day. So those tools are really good to do. So swimming obviously is really good. Like you mentioned, the yoga and Pilates, but even more so from a mental perspective of, when you build up for a game and you think a lot of players, you're going to be thinking about it Saturday night. You've got some people that will do visualization. Some people might not be nervous. Some people might be. Absolutely. They prepare their bodies on the Saturday to then kind of meet that game on a Sunday. And you think about like the anxiety and motivation levels that are happening all throughout that day, to then come down on a Monday after you've played, regardless if it's a win, draw or loss, you've kind of been in a high mental state probably throughout the weekend, preparing for that physical moment or game, should I say. And I think that's where like those tools you mentioned are just as important for the mental aspect as they are just for the physical aspect too. So yeah, I always recommend, players should do some kind of recovery the next day. Obviously it's different if we're talking about fringe players who might not have had the chance to get on as much. Absolutely. They're probably going to adapt how they train and when heavy sessions might be or harder sessions might be for them. It could be a Monday or Tuesday because they haven't had the kind of content everyone else would have had on that Sunday when they've played. But yeah, I think the recovery aspect is huge, and it's definitely important for players to do for both aspects, not just the physical but the mental as well. Absolutely.
It's really interesting you mentioned too, obviously the game being on Sunday for the women's game, and sort of the training. I mean, some teams I'm guessing are going to train Tuesday and Thursday, because obviously Wednesday and Friday, Friday, not many people will probably going to sort of train from a team perspective. But I suppose the gap between, say, Sunday and Tuesday, Jess, if the team is training Tuesday, would that not limit what the team can do physically, if particularly the players have played on a Sunday? Say if they kick off at 2:00 in the afternoon, then they're back on training at, say, Tuesday at 7. Would that sort of have an impact on what you could do physically with a player, that time frame?
Potentially. I think it's where the coaches have to be quite adaptable. Yeah. So there'll be games where a lot of players might play the 90 minutes on a Sunday and they feel quite fresh on a Monday, and they get to train and they're ready to go. And they could even do a little bit of conditioning. But there might be some weeks where, especially get later on into the season, where actually players are a little bit more fatigued, and you can get the vibe around camp when you get to train on Tuesday that actually everyone looks shattered, so maybe we should kind of adapt our session. So I think it's always important coaches have a bit of a plan A, plan B, but there's definitely, as long as players kind of look after themselves for the most part, they should be okay by the Tuesday to get going again in the evening, so long as they're looking after their bodies in terms of recovering and taking protein and hydration, things like that too. But yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of times where we've had a game on a Sunday and then recovered on a Monday, come back in on Tuesday and started with a bit of conditioning. Now, there's a difference between making people run for 2 hours versus doing sport-specific ones. So, making people do maybe 12 reps or 6 reps and then another 6 reps after a 2-minute break of 80% of their max 10-metre sprint, for example. Because you're still getting the conditioning in, you're still getting the sprinting in. It's relatable to the game and to that player in particular, but you're not kind of overloading them too much.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's been really, interesting and informative, speaking to you. That's for sure, Jess. No doubt the listeners have found that as well. In terms of your work, I mean, please feel free to share sort of any details you'd like in terms of if anyone wants to look up the work that you do. Jess, do you have any details you'd like to sort of share with our listeners?
Just more so, I'm more than happy for anyone to get in contact via LinkedIn. I'm quite active on there and like to post and repost any kind of interesting articles, but most of my work at the moment is basically around science for sport. So for those that don't know, I recommend checking it out because it's such a great resource and tool that we have. So anything sports science related is kind of what we encompass really, and there's mini courses on there for people to learn on all kinds of topics from some of the best practitioners in the world. Some of the courses on there even I've learned a bunch of stuff that I've not known before, and it's just a good tool to use because there's so much misinformation out there and it's quite easy to kind of pick up the wrong things. Absolutely. So we always make sure it's science support, it's always literature and research led, so you can always access the blog is for free. There's loads of amazing information on there, so I just recommend people to kind of check out everything Science Sport offers in terms of their socials. They've always got some good exercises and drills that are posted on there, and just I'm happy to engage and connect with anyone that's interested in women's football, the injury side, S&C, or even the science for sport aspect as well.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time, Jess. It's been really interesting and informative speaking to you, and wish you all the best for the forthcoming season. I know it's an off season now, a nice break, and sort of wish you all the best for the forthcoming season. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on.